You are on a ship somewhere in the Mediterranean, and the ship is sinking. Cargo shifts beneath your feet. Water is already climbing the lower deck. Everything you own, every coin you have ever earned, is in the hold, and the hold is filling fast. You will lose it all within the hour. This is not a metaphor. This actually happened to a real man in the early 3rd century BC. His name was Zeno of Citium, a merchant from Cyprus. And by the time he reaches the shore of Athens, he will own nothing but the clothes on his back. Most people would call this the worst day of his life. It will turn out to be the best one. Why? Because somewhere in that wreckage an idea was born that would outlive the Roman Empire, get whispered into the ear of emperors, get scribbled into the private notebook of a general on a freezing frontier, and 2,000 years later get quietly rebuilt into the therapy techniques millions of people use today just to get through a bad week. That idea is Stoicism, and almost everything you think you know about it is a little bit wrong. Say the word Stoic out loud to someone today, and watch what happens in their face. They picture someone cold, someone who doesn't cry at funerals, someone who bottles it up, grits their teeth and says, "I'm fine," through a clenched jaw. That is the popular picture. It is almost the opposite of the truth. Stoicism was never about feeling nothing. It was about understanding exactly why you feel what you feel, and discovering that most of your suffering is not coming from the world at all. It's coming from a story you are telling yourself about the world. That is the reframe this video is going to walk you through, slowly, with real evidence, real historical scenes, and real texts you can go read for yourself tonight if you want to. Let's start with what we actually know, because Stoicism is not myth or legend. It is unusually well documented for something this old. 3 sources carry almost the entire weight of what survives. The first is Diogenes Laertius, a biographer writing centuries after Zeno, whose book, Lives of Eminent Philosophers, is essentially the gossip column of ancient philosophy. It's where we get the shipwreck story in the first place. The second is Epictetus, a man born into slavery in Roman Asia Minor, whose teachings were transcribed by a student named Arrian into a text called the Discourses, and condensed into a short, brutal handbook called the Enchiridion. The third is Marcus Aurelius, Roman emperor, whose private notebook to himself, written in Greek during military campaigns, survives under the name Meditations, a slave and an emperor, writing the same philosophy 4 centuries apart. Think about that for a second. What kind of idea appeals equally to a man who owns nothing and a man who owns an empire? That question is the spine of this whole story. So let's go back to the beginning, to the shore, to Zeno, dripping wet, having just lost everything. Picture the scene properly. It is roughly 300 BC. Athens is still the intellectual capital of the known world, even though its political power has already faded. Zeno, in his early 30s, walks into the city with nothing. He wanders, according to Diogenes Laertius, into a bookshop. He picks up a copy of Xenophon's Memorabilia, a book of recollections about Socrates, a man who had been dead for nearly a century by this point. He reads it standing there in the shop. Something in it hits him like a second shipwreck, except this one doesn't drown him, it wakes him up. He reportedly asks the bookseller where he can find a man like this Socrates. A philosopher named Crates happens to be walking by. The bookseller points. "Follow him," he says. Zeno follows him, and over the following years, taught by Crates and other philosophers of the city, Zeno builds an entire school of thought, teaching not in a fancy academy, but under a public colonnade in the Athenian marketplace called the Stoa Poikile, the painted porch. That's where the name comes from. Stoicism isn't named after a feeling. It's named after a covered walkway where a shipwrecked merchant used to stand and talk. Here is the first thing worth sitting with. Zeno did not lose his fortune and then decide to stop caring about things. He lost his fortune and started asking a much sharper question. What, exactly, is actually within my control? His cargo wasn't. The storm wasn't. The market price of dye, which was his trade, wasn't. But how he responded to all of it, what he built out of the wreckage, that part was entirely his. This single distinction, later called the dichotomy of control, becomes the load-bearing wall of the entire philosophy. Everything else is decoration on top of it. Let's decode that term properly, because it matters and it is not complicated. The dichotomy of control simply means this. Some things are up to you, and some things are not. Your body, your reputation, your bank account, the weather, other people's opinions of you, whether your flight gets delayed, whether someone you love gets sick, none of that is actually up to you in the deepest sense. What is up to you is your own judgment, your own choices, your own effort, your own reaction. Epictetus opens the Enchiridion with almost exactly this sentence. Some things are within our power, and some are not. He then spends the rest of the book showing, situation after situation, what happens to people who confuse the two categories. And here is where his story gets almost unbearable, and also becomes the strongest piece of evidence in this whole video for what Stoicism actually is. Epictetus was not a comfortable academic philosopher theorizing about hardship from a couch. He was born a slave, likely in the Roman province of Phrygia, in what is now central Turkey, sometime around 55 AD. He belonged to Epaphroditus, a wealthy freedman who served as secretary to the Emperor Nero. Ancient sources report that his leg was permanently damaged, possibly through the deliberate cruelty of an owner, possibly through illness. The details are debated by historians, but the outcome is not. Epictetus lived the rest of his life with a limp. Now hold that image for a moment. A man with no legal freedom, no control over his own schedule, no control over his own body's fate, sits down and builds one of history's most influential philosophies around the idea that freedom has almost nothing to do with your circumstances and almost everything to do with your judgments. Is that convenient? No. It's the opposite of convenient. It's a philosophy forged specifically by someone who had nearly every external freedom stripped from him, and who therefore had to locate freedom somewhere the world couldn't reach. That's not a coincidence. That's the entire argument tested against the hardest possible case, by the person least able to fake it. Eventually, Epictetus gained his freedom and became a teacher himself, founding a school in Nicopolis, in Greece, drawing students from across the Roman world, including, later, the young men who would go on to advise emperors. His teachings were direct, sometimes almost rude in their bluntness, delivered as if he was shaking his students by the shoulders. One of his most famous formulations, paraphrased across centuries of translation, comes down to this. People are not disturbed by events, but by their opinions about events. Read that twice. It is not a comforting platitude. It is a claim about the actual mechanism of human suffering, and it is the single most important idea in this entire video. Let's build the evidence for it properly, because you're not upset by the thing, you're upset by your thought about the thing. Sounds almost too simple to be true. So test it against something concrete. Two people are stuck in the same traffic jam. Same cars, same delay, same weather. One of them arrives at work furious, pounding the wheel, ready to snap at the first person who talks to them. The other arrives calm, having spent the drive listening to a podcast, mentally rehearsing what they'll say in a meeting. Same external event, two completely different internal outcomes. What changed? Not the traffic. The traffic was identical. What changed was the story. Each person told themselves about what the traffic meant, about whether it was catastrophic or simply mildly inconvenient. Epictetus would say, the traffic is indifferent. Your judgment about the traffic is where all the suffering actually lives. This is the first counterintuitive twist of this video, and it's worth stating plainly because most people get it backwards. Most people assume Stoicism says, don't feel anything. What it actually says is closer to, notice where the feeling is actually coming from, because it is very rarely coming from where you think. It is not suppress your emotions. It is investigate your emotions, because most of them are built on a judgment you added on top of the raw event, and that judgment can be examined, and sometimes changed. Now walk forward roughly 100 years, from a freed slave teaching in Greece, to the most powerful man alive, ruling from the center of the largest empire on earth. This is where the second reconstruction of this video takes place, and it might be the most quietly devastating scene in all of ancient philosophy. Picture Marcus Aurelius, Roman emperor from 161 to 180 AD, not in a palace, but in a military tent on the northern frontier along the Danube River, in what is now roughly the border between Austria and Hungary, or further into the territory of modern Slovakia. This is the setting historians generally attribute to at least parts of Meditations, composed during the Marcomannic Wars, a grinding, exhausting, years-long conflict against Germanic tribes pressing on Rome's borders. Marcus Aurelius did not want this war. Contemporary sources and later historians describe him as a reluctant commander, a man who by temperament preferred philosophy to combat, forced by circumstance to spend the final years of his life fighting a war he never chose, on a frontier far from Rome, while also, according to the historical record, likely burying multiple children who died young, a devastating fact even by the standards of an era with brutally high child mortality. At night, By lamplight, in that tent, the most powerful man in the known world picks up a stylus and writes to himself. Not for an audience, not for publication. The Meditations were never intended to be read by anyone but Marcus Aurelius himself. That's part of what makes them so strange and so valuable as evidence. This isn't propaganda. This isn't a performance of wisdom for the public. This is a man alone, exhausted, grieving, cold, trying to talk himself into getting up the next morning and doing his job with some measure of decency and calm. Here is one of the most famous lines from that notebook, paraphrased rather than quoted directly. At the start of each day, remind yourself that you will meet people who are ungrateful, arrogant, deceitful, and difficult, and that this is simply what happens when someone doesn't understand the difference between good and evil, so don't let it surprise you or disturb your peace when it happens. Think about who is writing that. Not a monk in isolation, an emperor, about to spend the day making decisions that affect millions of people, bracing himself in advance for frustration, not by hoping frustration won't happen, but by deciding ahead of time exactly how much power he would allow it to have over him. This is where the second counterintuitive twist of the video arrives, and it's a big one. We tend to imagine that power and wealth insulate you from suffering. Marcus Aurelius is the loudest possible counterexample in the historical record. He had everything Rome could offer. Absolute authority, endless resources, the best education money could buy, having been personally mentored by teachers including the Stoic philosopher Junius Rusticus, whose library, according to accounts in the Meditations itself, first introduced Marcus to the writings of Epictetus. And still, none of it protected him from grief, from exhaustion, from years of war he didn't want, from the slow erosion of a body under constant stress. What Stoicism gave him wasn't an escape from suffering. It gave him a method for meeting suffering without being destroyed by it. That's a very different promise, and it's the honest one. Now let's reconstruct one more scene, smaller in scale, but just as important for understanding what this philosophy actually asked of people day to day. This scene involves a third major Stoic voice, Seneca, a wealthy Roman statesman, playwright, and advisor to the Emperor Nero, whose collection of letters to a friend named Lucilius, simply called Letters from a Stoic in most modern translations, remains one of the most practical, almost conversational pieces of ancient philosophy we have. Picture Seneca, not young and untested, but an older man holding immense political influence in Nero's Rome, a city famous for its excess, its scheming, its constant threat of sudden execution for anyone who fell out of favor. Seneca's letters describe, among many other things, a daily practice, reviewing the day each evening before sleep, asking himself plainly, what bad habit did I correct today? What fault did I resist? In what way am I improved? Not vague self-congratulation, a specific nightly accounting. This is not a man withdrawing from the world into abstract theorizing. This is a man embedded in one of the most dangerous political environments in history, using a daily discipline of self-examination simply to stay sane and stay good in a place actively working against both. Seneca also wrote directly and repeatedly about the shortness of life, most famously in an essay called On the Shortness of Life, arguing that people don't actually have too little time, they waste enormous amounts of the time they do have, on distraction, on other people's demands, on activities that leave nothing behind. That argument, written roughly 2,000 years ago, is essentially indistinguishable from a modern conversation about screen time, burnout, and productivity culture. The costume is Roman, the complaint is completely contemporary. Let's pause here and stack the evidence properly, because by now you've met three very different men. A shipwrecked merchant who lost his fortune and built a school under a painted porch. A disabled former slave who found more freedom in his own mind than most free men ever locate in their entire lives. An emperor who had every possible external comfort and still needed, every single night, to talk himself through grief and rage, using the exact same tools the slave had taught. Three completely different social positions. One shared discovery. Suffering does not scale neatly with how much you own, how much power you hold, or how bad your circumstances objectively are. It scales with the gap between what you expect from the world and what the world is actually willing to give you, and with how tightly you grip at things that were never fully yours to hold in the first place. This brings us to the third and final twist of this video, and it's the one most people find hardest to accept, because it cuts directly against modern self-help culture. We are constantly told to visualize success, to imagine our best life, to manifest positive outcomes. The Stoics did something almost the exact opposite, and archaeological and textual evidence shows it was one of their most consistently practiced techniques. It's called premeditatio malorum, a Latin phrase that simply means the premeditation of bad things. Seneca describes it directly in his letters. Before a journey, imagine the ship sinking, the road washing out, the horse throwing you. Not to become anxious about it, but to rehearse it calmly in advance, so that if it actually happens, you are not blindsided. You have already, in a sense, met the difficulty once before it arrives. This sounds bleak on the surface. It is actually one of the more quietly optimistic ideas in the whole philosophy, because it comes paired with a second half that's easy to miss. By imagining the loss of something in advance, calmly, deliberately, you also become sharply aware of how much you currently have that you are simply taking for granted. Marcus Aurelius writes about waking each morning and reminding himself of the plain, ordinary gift of simply being alive to do the day's work. Not because life was easy for him, precisely because it wasn't, and he needed the reminder. Now here is the modern mirror, and it's a wide one because this 2,000-year-old philosophy has quietly resurfaced in more corners of contemporary life than almost any other ancient idea still in circulation. Start with therapy. Cognitive behavioral therapy, one of the most widely used and most clinically supported forms of talk therapy practiced today, is built directly on the Stoic premise that our emotional reactions come from our interpretations of events, not the events themselves, and that by examining and revising distorted interpretations, we can change how we feel without needing to change the world around us. Aaron Beck, the psychiatrist widely credited as a founder of cognitive behavioral therapy in the mid-20th century, has been explicit in his own writing about the direct influence of Stoic thought, and particularly Epictetus, on the therapy's foundational logic. A philosophy first tested by a limping ex-slave in Roman Greece is, right now, being used in therapists' offices around the world to help ordinary people manage anxiety and depression. Now look at the modern obsession with control, or more precisely, the modern epidemic of trying to control things that were never controllable in the first place. Think about how much daily anguish comes from checking a phone for a reply that hasn't come, from refreshing a stock price you can't influence, from replaying an argument with someone who has already moved on, from worrying about a diagnosis before the test results are even back. In every single one of those cases, a Stoic would ask the same blunt question Epictetus asked 2,000 years ago. Is this actually within your control? If it isn't, the suffering you're adding on top of it isn't protecting you from anything. It's just extra weight, self-applied, for no return. Now look at social media outrage specifically, because it maps almost perfectly onto the dichotomy of control. Someone online says something false about you, or something cruel, or something wrong. Your blood pressure spikes. You start composing a reply in your head before you've even opened the app. But notice, their opinion, their post, their motives, none of that was ever within your control. It never will be. What is within your control is only your own response. Whether you engage, how you engage, whether you let a stranger's words rent space in your head for the rest of the afternoon. The Stoics would not tell you to never respond. They would tell you to notice, clearly, which part of the situation is actually yours to manage, and to stop mistaking the rest of it for your job. And look finally at grief itself, the heaviest test case of all, because Stoicism has sometimes been unfairly caricatured as telling people not to grieve. That is not what the evidence shows. Marcus Aurelius, by every historical account, grieved deeply for children he lost. What Stoicism offered was not the absence of grief, but a way of meeting grief without being consumed entirely by it, of remembering, even inside real pain, what was still within his power to do that day, to rule justly, to treat people fairly, to keep working at the specific job in front of him. Grief and functioning were never presented as opposites. They were something you were asked to hold at the same time. So let's return finally to where this video began. You are on that ship. The water is rising. Everything you own is about to disappear into the sea. Here is the reframe, fully turned now, sitting exactly where it should. That sinking ship was never really the disaster it looked like. It was the moment Zeno discovered, in the worst possible way, which things in his life had actually been his all along, and which things had only ever been borrowed from circumstance. The cargo was never his to keep forever. The judgment he built afterward, the school under the painted porch, the 400 years of thinkers who followed him from a slave's hut in Phrygia to an emperor's war tent on the Danube, that part was entirely his, and it survived every storm that came after it. You are still, in a sense, on that ship right now. Something in your life is sinking as you watch this, or will be soon, because that is simply what it means to be alive in a body, in a world, with people you love and things you can't fully protect. The Stoics never promised you a calmer sea. They promised you something more useful, that no matter how the water rises, the part of you that decides how to meet it was never actually underwater at all.